In this week's video, we're going to take a few really big steps forward in our study of both harmony and melody. After spending weeks looking at two-note harmonies through our study of intervals, we're going to expand our view to include three-note harmonies for the very first time. And that's going to open up quite a few new doors for us. On the second half of the video, we'll see a few ways how melody and harmony are actually quite interdependent. We're also going to learn the first steps to writing excellent melodies. And in the final segment, we're going to take a look at transposition, something that every singer, instrumentalist, and composer simply has to be familiar with. That makes for a lot to cover today, so let's not waste any time. Grab your textbook and something to write with, and let's get right into the good stuff. As we've touched on before, when we listen to music, we perceive it in basically two dimensions. In one sense, we hear the music as it moves forward through time, and this represents the horizontal nature of music. We know this as melody. And simultaneously, we're perceiving multiple sounds that occur at the same time, which represents the vertical nature of music. And this is what we call harmony. These ideas first appeared in our study of intervals, and we return to them now as we take a big step forward. Up to this point, our harmonies have been limited to only 2 notes at a time, but we're going to increase that up to 3 notes right now. So a chord is a group of 3 or more notes sounding simultaneously, and if that chord has exactly 3 pitches inside it, we call it a triad. Now, here's an example of a typical triad in Western music. Each of the 3 pitches of the triad has a special name, so let's begin there. We call the lowest pitch the root, and a triad is always named after its root. The next pitch is called the third, because it's always a third above the root. It may be either a major third or a minor third. The top pitch is called the fifth, because it's always a fifth above the root. And this could be a perfect fifth, a diminished fifth, or an augmented fifth. Notice also that the interval between the third and the fifth is a third as well, which can be major or minor. Okay, so that gives us a basic way to refer to each of the pitches in a triad. Root, third, fifth. The next thing we need to know about triads has to do with their basic construction. Triads are made up of 3 notes, yes, but those 3 notes are chosen by stacking thirds above a root note. These are what we call tertian chords, tertian meaning third, and the overwhelming majority of Western music is based on a tonal system of tertian harmonies. Now, a triad will sound different depending on the quality of thirds it's comprised of. And there are 4 triad types which we'll ultimately study. But today, we're going to begin by focusing on only one type. In a major triad, the third of the chord is located a major third above the root, and the fifth is located a minor third above that. You can think of it like a formula. A major triad is made of a root plus a major third plus a minor third. Now you can choose any pitch to be the root note, and as long as you use this formula to stack the remaining notes in thirds, then the resulting triad will have the same sound and qualities as every other major triad. Let's also measure the interval that forms between the root and the fifth of our major triad. There's a perfect fifth there, and that helps give this chord a sense of stability and arrival for which it's known. Lastly, as a result of stacking consecutive thirds, Every triad that we build will be made up of either 3 line notes or 3 space notes. How could we label this chord? Well, as we already mentioned, the chord is always named after the root. In this example on the screen now, our root is F natural, so we'll label this chord F. So now that we know a little something about major triads, let's try building a few ourselves. Ultimately, there's 2 methods to building triads that we'll use, but today we're going to focus on just one of them. I call this the scale method, since you'll need to remember the major scale for this technique. Let's say we're asked to build a D major triad. From the name of the chord, we know the root is D natural. Now the trick here is to imagine the D major scale and use scale degrees 1, 3, and 5, or Do, Mi, and Sol, to build our triad. As long as you remembered the scale correctly, these 3 notes will always end up building a major triad. Now, I want to unpack this scale method for just a second, because it's going to lead us up to something pretty special. Looking at this method a little differently, we could also say that we just built a triad shape on top of Do, or scale degree 1. And then we just relied on the notes in the key signature to build our chord. So what would happen if we did that for each of the remaining notes in our scale? What if we put a triad on each scale degree, and we didn't apply any accidentals to it other than what's already in our key signature? What triad types would we end up with? And would any of those triads be major, like it is on Do? Well, these are what we call diatonic triads. And remember, diatonic was just the term that we gave to the notes that make up the major scale. Since each of these triads are built with only the notes from the major scale, we can call them diatonic triads. We already know that the diatonic triad built on scale degree 1 will always be a major triad. And as it turns out, there are 2 more major triads in our set. The chords built on scale degrees 4 and 5, or on Fa and Sol. So no matter which key we go to, whenever we build triads on 1, 4, or 5, and as long as we don't add any accidentals to the chord beyond what's in the key signature, we'll always end up with a major triad. We already learned that we're going to name chords by their root, and that's what we call chord symbols. We'll sometimes use a second method of labeling chords that we call Roman numerals. In this system, Roman numerals are used to indicate the function and position of a chord with respect to the tonic. We've actually been doing this for ages with scale degrees and solfege syllables, which help us to hear a pitch in relation to 1 or Do. Well, now we'll just apply that to chords as well through the use of Roman numerals. When analyzing chords like this, the first thing to consider is the scale degree that each chord is built upon. Using that number, uppercase Roman numerals are used to indicate major triads. We customarily place the Roman numeral analysis just below the staff. Well, that's going to wrap up our first look at triads, and there's a lot to digest in there. Be sure to get familiar with building major triads using the scale method and labeling your chords with both chord names and Roman numerals. Now, you can bet we'll be returning to this material in the near future to fill in a lot of these gaps, but these are the ground rules for much of what's to come. At this point, let's take a short break before we turn our attention over to melodies. So hit pause on the next screen to stretch your legs or grab some orange slices, and when you're back, We got more knowledge for you after the break. If harmony is the vertical dimension of music, then melody is its horizontal dimension. And really, I guess it's a little disingenuous to think of them as two distinct entities. After all, vertical harmonies are usually formed by multiple horizontal melodies as they go through time. And as we'll see in just a second, melodies are often just horizontal or linear arrangements of their underlying harmonies. So, in this way, melody and harmony are inextricably linked, and they work hand in hand to serve the music. In this section, we want to examine how melodies and harmonies interact with one another, with the hopes that we might learn the makings of a good melody. Our examples in this section will require the use of a grand staff, and we'll write the melody in the upper staff with the treble clef, while our chords will go in the lower staff with the bass clef. Now, remember, although this looks like two separate lines of music, it's only one, and the upper and lower staffs are sounding at the same time. Let's begin with perhaps the most fundamental way that we can compare melody and harmony. Let's check each note of the melody against the underlying harmony and ask one simple question. Is this note in the chord or not? Melody notes that are found in the harmony are called chord tones, and melody notes that are not found in the harmony are called non-chord tones. Let's work through our example on the screen, measure by measure, to determine which notes in the melody are chord tones and which are non-chord tones. In this first measure, our harmony is a B-flat major triad, containing the chord tones B-flat, D natural, and F natural. You can see the chord tones highlighted in the melody in blue and the non-chord tones in red. Now keep going measure by measure and chord by chord like this until you reach the end of the melody. And at the end, stepping back, there are a handful of things that stand out to us. First of all, notice how from measure to measure, the melody is predominantly composed of the notes in the harmony. They're mostly chord tones up there. Now in the first measure, for example, 3 of the 4 notes in the melody are chord tones, and only 1 note is a non-chord tone. There's no measure in our example that has more non-chord tones than it has chord tones. Now secondly, the chord tones appear on strong beats and arrival points, while non-chord tones are more likely to appear on weak beats, or even better, in the eighth notes between beats. Often, these non-chord tones are serving as embellishments to the melody, or they might simply work to connect chord tones one to the other. Practice analyzing another melody and chords using the examples in the textbook, or maybe by taking a song out of your audition book. You'll find that non-chord tones are used in all sorts of ways to create colors and contrast. It's also pretty enlightening to see which lyrics are set to chord tones and which are set to non-chord tones. Now, once you've had some practice comparing melodies and harmonies like this, go ahead and try your own hand at harmonizing a melody. That means take a freestanding melody without chords and choose your own chords to play underneath. I recommend limiting yourself to 1, 4, and 5 chords at first, and then choosing which of the 3 would best support the melody in each measure. The goal here is looking at repeated notes or strong beats in the melody, and assuming that those would make chord tones. Then, find a harmony that best matches those chord tones. The answers aren't always cut and dry, and often 2 or more harmonies might work under the same melody. The final segment of today's video is all about transposition, the process of moving a pitch or a collection of pitches up or down by a set interval while keeping the relationship of every pitch constant. That's the definition straight out of the book. I mean, word for word, because that's it. I couldn't come up with anything better than that. Now, as musical theater performers, most of us have already encountered transposition in our audition books. How many of you have a song in there that's in a different key than it was originally recorded? Well, that's a transposition. The two different keys still sound similar because all of the notes were raised or lowered by the same interval and in the same direction. Now, in your career, you probably won't have to transpose by hand very often. But if you ever do, and there will come a time where you do, there are two approaches you can take. First, we have transposing by interval. In this method, we simply go note by note and alter them one at a time by the same interval. Here, we're given an original melody, and we're asked to transpose it up by a minor third. So when transposing by interval, we're just going to look at one note at a time from the melody and raise it up a minor third. This method might be a little slower, but it's methodical, and as long as you're good with your intervals, it's also super reliable. Now, the alternative is transposing by key. Whether you realize it or not, you've actually been transposing by key ever since we introduced solfege syllables. Those syllables allowed us to keep the relationship between pitches constant no matter what key we went to. Well, now, we're just going to use the skill to transpose. Begin by analyzing the original melody with solfege syllables. Then, transfer those syllables to another staff where our transposed melody will go. Notice that the key signatures are already in place. Our original key is D major, and the key a minor third above that is F major. To complete the transposition, just provide the pitches in our new key that correspond to each of the solfege syllables we just brought over. A good command of each key and major scale is necessary here, but it makes for a much faster way to transpose. The other clever thing about transposing by key like this is that it applies to harmonies too. We learned earlier that Roman numerals are basically like scale degrees but for chords. They tell us a chord's position within the key. So if we're given chords to transpose, we only need to convert the chords to Roman numerals, transfer those to a new staff with the new key signature, and then wrap up by writing the harmonies in the new key. So either way, whether transposing by interval or transposing by key, you get the same result. We get a melody that's been rewritten in a totally different key, but it still sounds essentially the same, since every note was altered by the same set interval and in the same direction. Hey, that's a wrap on today's video, and I admit there's a lot to get familiar with in there. We started out with an introduction to three-part harmonies, which took us from major triads all the way up to Roman numeral analysis. On the second half of the video, we started looking at melodies too. We learned how to determine which notes are chord tones and which are non-chord tones, and we also found multiple ways of transposing melodies to other keys. While it's all still fresh in your mind, you might want to practice some of the exercises in chapters 10 through 12 of our textbook, The Music Fundamentals for Musical Theater. I think it's one thing to understand these concepts, and it's another thing to really master them. And the latter comes through repeatedly putting the concepts to practice, either with the examples in our text or through analyzing pieces from the musical theater canon. Next time, we'll get some more practice with major triads, and we'll also introduce the concept of phrases in music. The next video is also the last video in this unit, So we'll be due to take the performer's perspective on a whole nother set of musical markings. This time, we'll be looking at repeat signs and the roadmap to reading your sheet music. Until then, be kind to each other, and thanks for watching.